life on Earth is related. This means that all the biodiversity we find on our planet comes from a common ancestor that lived about 3.8 billion years ago. No matter how different we seem, we share an evolutionary history with fungi, bats, and even bacteria. This diversity arose because over time, species change. So each generation is a little different from the previous generation. Traits present in the common ancestor become modified over time. So, why are there so many species? Sometimes a species splits into two. This usually happens when populations of a species become geographically isolated from one another, and the two populations evolve independently. Over time, they become so different, they're separate species. This is known as speciation. Evolutionary theory is the scientific framework that helps us to understand relationships between species. Because all life forms share a single common ancestor, relationships between them can be represented diagrammatically as a large branching tree. Charles Darwin used this idea to help describe his theory of evolution. Other early naturalists, like Ernst Haeckel, used it too. To build an evolutionary tree, you need to discover features that organisms share. These shared characteristics must be inherited. Shared characteristics provide evidence we need to build an evolutionary tree. Evidence can be embryological, anatomical, or based on fossils. It can also be molecular information, such as sequences of DNA, RNA, or proteins. Just like a real tree, an evolutionary tree has different parts: roots, branches, nodes, and tips. Each segment represents something different. The root, at the base of a tree, marks the most ancient species in the tree. It represents the most recent common ancestor of all groups in the tree. Branches provide the pattern or structure of the tree. They indicate the evolution of different lineages from a common ancestor. A node is the point where a branch splits. It marks a point of speciation and the common ancestor of all branches and tips extending from that node. A tip, similar to a leaf, is the end point of a branch. It represents the end point of the evolution of that branch, in this case, a species. Evolutionary trees illustrate relatedness between life forms and allow us to trace back through time the lineage of a particular species. Evolutionary trees can be drawn in different ways. Each style of a tree tells us about relatedness between organisms and their evolutionary history. Some evolutionary trees show the rate of evolutionary change by using a scale. A basic unit of any evolutionary tree is a clade. This is a group of organisms that includes an ancestor and all its living and extinct descendants. A clade is equivalent to a branch on an evolutionary tree. For instance, consider the evolutionary tree of eutherian mammals. All eutherians share a common ancestor. Because all eutherians share a common ancestor, the entire eutherian tree represents a clade. Clades can be nested within each other. The major branches on this tree also define clades. Members of a clade share a common evolutionary history they don't share with any other group. This branch represents the clade Laurasiotheria. Other clades are nested within it, like the bat clade and the carnivore clade. All members of a clade share some similar characteristics because they arose from the same common ancestor. So how do we read information on an evolutionary tree? It's the branching pattern of an evolutionary tree and the length of its branches that provide information about relatedness and descent from a common ancestor. This tree shows the carnivora clade. All of these animals share a common ancestor shown at the root of the tree. We can see that all of today's living carnivorous species came from two main branches that arose from this common ancestor. Feliformia, that is, cat-like carnivorans, and Caeniformia, the dog-like carnivorans. At the tips of the tree are all living carnivoran families. To find out which carnivorans are most closely related, we trace back from tips to nodes. For instance, seals are more closely related to bears than they are to dogs because they share a more recent common ancestor. Hyenas, dogs, and cats are all members of the carnivora clade. But are hyenas more closely related to dogs or cats? Hyenas look a lot like dogs. And you might think that hyenas are closely related to dogs because of their close position to each other at the tips of this evolutionary tree. But reading across the tips isn't correct. We can actually rotate the tips and still have an accurate tree. We need to read the branching pattern, which tells us that hyenas are part of the Feliformia cat-like carnivores. Hyenas share a more recent common ancestor with cats than they do with dogs. We can trace the hyena lineage by moving back along the branches of the tree. In the past, data used to build evolutionary trees were usually based entirely on anatomical and fossil evidence. But sometimes, behavior and ecology of organisms was also used. Now, science can look directly at genetic material. And as all evolutionary change has a genetic basis, this molecular evidence is powerful. Molecular evidence is changing our understanding of evolutionary relationships between life forms. Take eutherian mammals. This is how scientists once thought they were related. The tree is based on anatomical studies and information from fossils. But molecular evidence tells us a different story. Molecular evidence has resulted in evolutionary trees being abandoned, rebuilt, and rearranged. But it still needs to be matched with evidence from other sources. Using evidence from all sources, fossils, anatomy, embryos, genes, will bring us closer to unraveling evolutionary relationships between life forms.